Have you ever considered why the church meets in a building versus a private residence? Or perhaps you're having a conversation right now with somebody about this very topic. Are they having an issue with churches and public spaces? If you answered yes to any one of these questions, this video is for you. Hey, welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time to Bible Theory, please let me know in the comments below. I'll love to get to know you. I'm so glad that you stopped by, and thank you so much for checking out my channel and this video. And if you are a returning listener, welcome back. Woo woo! Welcome to Bible Theory, homie.
Taking the church to the streets, homie.
Say what?
Okay, welcome to part 2 of exploring biblical foundations. Are house churches scriptural? This is a short series where we're going to go ahead and do a deep dive on home churches, on the home church movement, because it is a movement. So in this part, let's go ahead and review the topic of church buildings. Are they biblical or not? Let's go. Point number 1, finding common ground. You see, the church in the New Testament teaches about the church as a people and not as a building. I think we can all agree that people are the church. The Bible makes this very clear. I don't have much time to get into it, but to make it very short and simple, the term church in the Greek means ecclesia. It basically translates into the word assembly or the called out ones. Jesus uses the word ecclesia in Matthew 16 verse 18, where he says, and I quote, "I will build my assembly," end quote. In Acts chapter 11 verse 26, Barnabas and Saul met with the assembly. There's that word again, church. Also, check out this for your consideration as you study the word church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 9, Paul says that he persecuted the what? The called out ones, the church. There it is again. It's very clear that the word ecclesia does not refer to building structures, anything like that, but to people. And I believe that this is a good common ground to begin such conversations, because we do have common ground. So before we get to disagreements, it's important to start with agreements. You know what I mean? All right, let's keep going. Point number 2, even more common ground. But you see, in the light of scripture, there is no mandate for church buildings. All you have to do is take a quick survey of the New Testament and you'll go ahead and come to this conclusion, which is the common ground that we share with home churches. If you look at in the book of Acts, in the day of Pentecost, where 3,000 people came to saving faith, they did not say to each other, "Hey, now's a good time to go ahead and build a big old building. Let's go ahead and go over there and build one." They did not say that. We don't see that in the text. So therefore, that's how I could come to that conclusion. This is one of the basic common grounds we share with home churches. Another common ground that we could also come together in a sense of unity, is that in the New Testament, we can both agree that we don't see any official naming of any Christian buildings or any building budgets of any of that sort that we may see today. So, are meeting in giant official structures a biblical pattern for the church? Question mark. I would say yes. Here's where that but comes in. Just because the Bible is silent on this matter doesn't make it unbiblical to meet in bigger venues other than your private residence. The Bible never forbids Christians to have private property. The Bible never forbids Christians to purchase larger buildings or to build structures for churches. You see, we may share a common connection here, but this is where the rubber meets the road. The Christians that do decide to meet in public venues, like in public building structures that are designed and used specifically for services, worship services, which is pretty much the majority of Christianity since time immemorial. You know, we are not making a statement like the home churches are making a statement. And when they do make a statement like, quote unquote, you cannot meet in public buildings, only in church, just like the New Testament, what they're doing is they're just making a statement and they're overstating that statement. They're basically making it into a dogma, into a doctrine, into a prescribed method that cannot be unbroken or deviated from. And if you do, you basically lose your Christianity. You're not a Christian. But there is a danger here that I am pointing out in all my episodes within this series. They're making an overstatement here. That is basically the emotions and thrust of their argument. So yes, there is no mandate in scripture for church buildings, but there is no command against them. There is nothing. We see no positive positives and we see no negatives for or pro. But let's go ahead and go on to the next point. Point number 3, the early church had some buildings. You see the psychological issue here for people who assert that it is unchristian to go ahead and build buildings specifically designed for worship. They may not have a problem with prayer, getting together. They may not be ashamed of the gospel, quote unquote, or the Bible. There seems to be an underlying issue here with that kind of psychology here. Let's just use the word psychology for a second. They seem to have a real problem with buildings. That's the issue. If you go ahead and listen to their basic key arguments, it goes something like this, and I quote, "The pattern in the New Testament is that the church assembled in people's houses, that the gospel spread from home to home. Building structures that came later after the day of Pentecost, after, Constantine, after Augustine and all that, it comes from pagan traditions," end quote. And I'll go ahead and address the tradition issue in a different episode. Let's go ahead and put the tradition stuff or the tradition phobia and red flags within tradition. Let's go ahead and move that conversation out of this episode and let's put it to the side for now and let's address this issue of public buildings, public domains. It's an interesting and very sincere observation that they do assert that pagans built buildings. I think that's an obvious observation. Captain Obvious, hello. Everybody built buildings, you know what I mean? It's like the pagans built stuff too. It's not that we're arguing against that, but they make the case, but they do make a sincere argument. Like, yes, the pagans did build the pyramids. The pagans did build the wall of China. The pagans did build the sun, moon, temples in Mexico and Central America and all that. It was not the Christians that built none of those. That's 100% fact. But I want to go ahead and zoom in on that argument and highlight an illogical connection there. It's not just an emotional one, but it is an illogical one. Can Christians build buildings too? Go ahead and answer me. Can we build stuff too? Or is it against God's law or against what's the problem here? Can Christians build too? That's my question to them. The illogic goes something like this as well. When you keep zooming in on this type of argument is if Christians put on a pair of pants, let's just take an example of putting on your jeans, okay? So if a Christian puts on the pair of jeans, pair of Levi's with their own two legs, one leg at a time, just like every person on the earth, if you have two legs, right? Let's just go ahead and assume you have two legs, okay? You put on your pants one leg at a time, just like the pagan. Does that make that Christian pagan now? Because they're putting on their pants the same way as that pagan, one leg at a time? Go ahead and answer me that one. It's just the illogic continues to unravel this type of argument, you know what I mean? It's an interesting, obvious observation they're making, right? That pagans built stuff too, but it's an illogical connection that I want to highlight here, and I want to hit home, and I want to drive it in deep, okay? If a Christian chews bubblegum and a pagan chews bubblegum, the question is the chewing of the bubblegum pagan now? So no more bubblegum in Christianity now, or what's going on here? That's why it's an interesting argument, but you have to look at church history, okay? You do have to look at church history. So the earliest churches ever built, okay, let's go there since we're talking about structures, right? That are built churches and all this. You do have to be taken back with amazement and be like, whoa. And you do notice something here. Okay? Go ahead, look it up. So the earliest church ever built in terms of structure is in the nation of Syria. And that dates back to like 233 AD. And that is way before the Roman Emperor Constantine, because Constantine is a buzzword. They love to use Constantine. Constantine did this and he did that. Like, so what? Everybody does this, right? Biden does this, Biden does that. How about that, Mapples, right? So that church in Syria dates way before Constantine ever lived. And Constantine lived in the 4th century. This church, the first church that archaeologists has discovered, was in the early 3rd century, okay? Almost 100 years before. Archaeology digs of that area in Syria shows this building was an organized, fully grown, operational church building. And I'll go ahead and link that down below. Follow the links. Go ahead and do some research. It's an amazing discovery. It had large assembly hall. It had prayer rooms, outer courts that was filled. It was just like a modern day church building, right? Another ancient church has been discovered in the country of Jordan. So that's near Syria, okay? If you don't know your geography. So this one built a little later, but within the same century. It was built in around estimated 293 AD, just a few decades after the one in Syria was built. And this one was recently found in 1998. For those millennials out there born in 98 or after, here, just to let you know, the team of archaeologists unearthed a fully operational church. It had a cemetery with at least 20 buried there, and it had a big old, sanctuary hall to fit and hold more than 60 people. You could go ahead and continue looking at church history to look to see if this argument fits the pattern before Constantine. Do we see big old buildings that Christians use other than houses before the time of Constantine? Does that argument hold up? And if you look at history, the answer would be yes. We do see structures being used publicly by Christians that are not their homes for worship before the time of Constantine. Another church that is still in operation today, man, it's dating back to the early 300s. So right after those churches were built, you do have this other church. You could go ahead and do your research and you'll see all kinds of buildings. But wait, there's more. And of course, the second Jewish temple, by the way, in Jerusalem, built by King Herod, and it was built somewhere between 20 BC and completed around 60 to 63 AD. Yeah, that big old structure that we see that Jesus talks about, saying that it's going to be destroyed later on, by the Romans. Yes, the Jewish temple. That's the one I'm talking about. If you read the Jewish historian Josephus, and let me quote something that he said, because he's an eyewitness to the Jewish temple that King Herod built, and he said this, check this out, and I quote, "The exterior of the building lacked nothing that could astound either the mind or eye," end quote. And of course, the temple was a big, beautiful building dedicated to God, right? We all know the story, like Jesus foretold in the Gospels that the building would be destroyed, and it was destroyed by the Romans around 70 AD. So what do you do with the Jewish temple? It's in the Bible, it's a big old building, but did you know that the early church, after the day of Pentecost, they used the temple as a temporary place for worship and gathering for the saints? Let's go ahead and check out these verses. So in Acts 21, verses 23 to 26, Paul takes 4 Christian men into the temple for what? For purification, ceremonies, and for offerings for each one of them. How do you explain that? Why will Paul do that? Why will Paul consider the temple still valid in his Christian thinking? If no buildings matter and only home churches matter, why is Paul taking these people into a public domain, a big old structure? Because I think the structure matters. I think the temple, before it was destroyed, still mattered to Paul. It still mattered to the Christians. That's what I think. And they were not against the buildings. Let's continue reading. In Acts chapter 3, right after the day of Pentecost, a chapter after, Peter and John, what did they do? Peter walks around and he heals a man in the temple, right? And that's after their dedicated time of prayer. Where? At the temple. And it's not like Peter and John didn't pray anywhere else, or, they valued that structure that God ordained to be in existence called the temple. They valued it. In Acts chapter 2, we also see this in Acts chapter 2, verse 46 through 47, but check out this little portion, and I quote, "Every day they continue to meet together in the temple courts," end quote. The early church valued the temple courts. The early church valued the temple, even though it was predestined to be destroyed and done away with. And I'm only pointing to these ancient references out, not to make a case that we need the temple again, right? I'm not making the case that we need buildings and we need to hold on to them for dear life. Like, no, that would be idolatry, right? The Pharisees made the temple as an idolatry thing, but that's a different conversation. That's like a side conversation there, but I do want to point that out, that hey, they did have a temple, that Christians in the ancient times, they did use public structures, and history and archaeology proves this. If you want to answer the question of the reason why buildings replace house churches, I think there are 3 primary reasons. There could be other ones that I'm not thinking about, and if you think of others, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to get to know those other reasons. But here are the ones I found. Reason number 1, the church began to expand and grow in numbers. Like, for example, the apostles baptized 3,000 people in one day. Like, you can't stop the church from growing. That's just one day, y'all. That's not every single day. Imagine 3,000 people every single day in every week of the year. That's a lot of people right there. You cannot stop the church from growing. It was just busting from the seams. There was no stopping it. It was like a train. You better move out the way. Reason number 2, house churches were temporary and not permanent. You see, houses in the 1st and the 2nd centuries were tiny in comparison to houses we see in a modern day. They didn't really have like 2, 4, 5, 6 bedrooms, something like that, 3,000 square feet. Houses back in the 1st century were like tiny little spaces where a few people lived and they all shared, the same room, living quarters. So houses back in the day was just unreasonable in terms of size. They could not fit possibly 60, 200, let alone 1,000 people for a church service. It's unthinkable. It was was not manageable. It was not fit for a worship service. Reason number 3, after the Edict of Milan of 313 AD, you see Christianity just taking over the public domain. We see massive building constructions across the world after this executive order. It became the normal pattern for believers across the world to build buildings and to meet publicly and openly, since Christianity was legal now. It was not a secret replacement, as many of those home churches will love you to believe. Point number 4, what do buildings actually mean? Buildings, especially big ones, are invisible words only with nails and bricks. But what do they communicate? Buildings speak of permanence. Sometimes they speak of different things depending on the location and culture. You see, when old empires built some mega structure, they told the world around them something. The pyramids communicated something. The palaces of the kings and princesses, they all communicated things. The temples of the gods, they all communicated things. They have a message. The buildings spoke. Now you could say buildings speak of military might, grandeur, pride, all these things, money, influence. All those things could also be said of buildings. Buildings are also representations of what that culture believes, translated into architecture. If a culture is religious, it will show in their architecture. If a culture is minimalistic and disciplined, that will also show. If a culture is materialist and postmodern, that will also be evident. When a church is built in the middle of a downtown, let me ask you this. What does that communicate? I'd love to hear your answers down below in the comment section, so don't be shy. Go ahead and let me know your answer. Thank you. Let's go ahead and process this further. So, if a missionary comes into a pagan nation where they got idols and temples built for their gods, let me ask you this. What are those missionaries supposed to do with those type of structures? Great question. You see, in many cases, the answer to that question has been provided to us. Like, for example, in the case of Patrick of Ireland or Boniface, Christians in the Roman Empire after Constantine, you see this. Many examples. We see Christians ripping down those pagan idols, those pagan temples. So that's one way of doing it. You rip them all down. But you rip them down to do what? To replace it with big, beautiful churches. To replace it with big, beautiful seminaries. You create the culture, recreate it. You tear down the old one and you communicate a new message. You see, for that example, you're basically sending a message that God wins, the pagans lose. The gospel was here and the idols are RIP. So in conclusion, God is building his church with his people, his called out ones, whom he has assembled since the beginning of time. And just because we find agreement on the term church and the idea of church doesn't refer to a location or a public building, we must be careful not to make an overstatement about that fact when we know that throughout history, God has authorized 2 different temples at 2 different times with his endorsement on it to be constructed here in time and space. We cannot be against that, so we have to be careful. So in theory, I don't think it matters so much the location of where church people get together to worship per se, because I don't think this is an issue between public domain versus private residence. I think the real issue, in my opinion, is with the concept of the church, or should I say the lack thereof. Okay, that's it. That's the end of it. Thank you so much for tuning in, listening. Hopefully this helped you, edify you in your conversations as you carry on throughout your week, throughout your workday, all that stuff. So please hit the like button, subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell for future notifications, and watch out for video number 3 on this topic. Thank you and God bless.